Hasn't a lot changed for trans people recently? 2 decades ago and no one had heard of us. Now, we're everywhere, terrified in bathrooms, banned from sports, wondering at what point on a first date we're obligated to reveal information about our genitals. Increased visibility is both a blessing and a curse, but one thing that has clearly changed for the better is increased access to information, hormones, and surgery. More and more people are able to medically transition. And as the overall successful transition rate has gone up, so too have the rates of detransition and transition regret. While this is partially just the obvious result of any medical procedure being more widely available, there are also specific factors at play that are probably worth further exploration. Unfortunately, this is usually done in a way that hurts us. 2 years ago, in one particularly poisonous article in The Atlantic, Jesse Singal floated the idea of social contagion, the theory that you could catch the trans. A couple of months ago, J.K. Rowling came out as a full mask-off transphobe and wrote her own thoroughly uneducated think piece on the matter. These arguments have already been made and debunked several times over, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Physical transition works for the vast majority of people who get it, so the risk of regret is in fact very low. And it remains very difficult to access for most people. The idea that prepubescent kids are being put on hormones is not even accurate. Prepubescent children are normally put on hormone blockers, delaying puberty and giving them more time to think about which one they want. Finally, as with any body alteration, like a piercing, a tattoo, or even plastic surgery, there is a chance you might not like it. This is a risk that should be very thoroughly considered and understood beforehand. And in many cases of transition regret, there is individual failure on the part of the person seeking transition, their parents, or a medical professional contributing to the mistakes that were made. All of this is true, but that tends to be the end of it. We address detransition only to say, it's terrible that this happened, but it doesn't happen very often, so don't take away our life-saving medication and surgery? And no wonder, because that's what most people talking about detransition are trying to do. As a result, we end up arguing about how much it happens and what shouldn't be done to prevent it, rather than why it happens and what should. This is a complex and sensitive topic, but I don't think it's one we should be scared of. There are patterns in the detransition narrative that are really worth exploring. Ones that resonate with me quite a lot personally as a de-sister myself. Before we start, a note on terminology. Detransition and transition regret are slightly different terms. The former refers to the process of attempting to undo or reverse transition procedures, whereas the latter just refers to regretting those procedures. While they're frequently associated with one another, the two are separate and the distinction is important. Many people detransition for reasons other than regret, while other people may regret aspects of their transition but choose not to reverse them. In this video, I will unusually be using the terms AMAB and AFAB. Without getting into too much detail, I don't like these terms from a biological standpoint because the words male and female are inextricably linked to gender, and this terminology therefore muddies the distinction between gender and sex. However, in this specific instance, because assigned gender is relevant to the topic, I will be using those terms with that caveat, and I hope that we shift to different terminology later. Part 1. Misogyny. I wrote the first draft of this script when the Jesse Singal article first came out, because of how much the theme of desistance, that is, experiencing physical dysphoria but deciding not to physically transition, resonated with me personally, and because of how wrongly it was being spun. I didn't film it or release it because it was too personal, if you can believe that. There is a part of me that is reluctant to be too explicit about my gender journey, because at the moment people call me a man as an insult and I kind of like it. Getting specific about my biology on camera will lead to people insulting me in more precise ways, but that kind of behaviour is sort of part of the problem I want to explore. So here we go. Prior to puberty, I accepted the idea that I was a girl because As far as I could see, at that point, being one didn't stop me doing anything or being who I was, so I didn't have a problem with it. It was about age 13, 14 when the problem started. I became very repulsed by adolescent sexual behaviour, by the way the genders became very sharply defined in a way they hadn't been before, by misogyny and sexism and society's complete apathy towards it. I also became aware that many of my own behaviours, thought processes, and my relationship with my own body was atypical. I experienced severe body dysphoria the second it started developing. I felt uncomfortable wearing makeup and dresses and things. I did try all that stuff. I was experimenting, but it always felt wrong. It felt like I was pretending to be something I wasn't and that everyone could see it. It basically felt like I was in drag. After a lot of research, I found out about being transgender, and that seemed to fit. I looked up the definition of gender dysphoria, and I clearly had it. I did what gender is your brain quizzes and was routinely diagnosed male on the basis of being able to rotate shapes in my head and being terrible at recognizing faces. Validating as it was to think of myself as born in the wrong body, even at that point I knew the reality wasn't that simple. Thinking critically about gender led me to understand it as a social construct rather than empirically observable fact. There is no such thing as a male or a female brain. However, it was a construct that the rest of the world adhered to and therefore not one I could just opt out of. Therefore, if I wasn't a girl, for all intents and purposes, I was a boy. By the time I'd done enough research to understand myself as such, I was halfway through puberty, and I felt like it was too late to undo the damage. But I also didn't want all of the changes that testosterone would give me. I didn't want more hair on my body, I definitely didn't want less hair on my head, but I couldn't pick and choose. I couldn't go back and start on T before puberty, and surgery without hormones wasn't presented as an option. It was just either you transition or you don't. Having given it a lot of thought, I decided that transition wouldn't give me what I wanted, and I stopped pursuing it as an option. Now, my story is really not unique. As a matter of fact, virtually every trending narrative I see follows a similar direction to mine. A young AFAB individual, usually some combination of queer, gender non-conforming, or neurodiverse, particularly autistic, suffering from sexualization, misogyny, or other trauma. The only difference is that these people start transitioning before they realize that it's not right for them. There are a couple of reasons as to why this is the most common narrative we see. Transphobes ultimately believe that a person's assigned gender is their real gender, and therefore are inclined to position AFAB individuals as misled, helpless, and confused, while positioning AMAB people as dangerous and aggressive. For people who don't understand trans people very well or have yet to learn the difference between gender and sex, this is an extremely effective scaremongering tactic. But while overall detransition occurs for a plethora of reasons, including transphobia, AFAB detransitioners do seem to provide a higher percentage of transition regret. And while this is frequently remarked on, its causes are rarely explored, and that is because doing so undermines the social contagion narrative. In a patriarchal society, being perceived as anything other than male is an oppressive experience. This means having to deal with threats that men don't, having to adhere to standards that men don't, having to work harder to achieve the same goals, and being met with derision and resentment when you do. It means discrimination, dismissal, aggressive sexualization, and generally reduced safety. And that's if you're cis. If you're trans, you get all that plus additional risks of ostracization and violence. Therefore, people who were assigned male at birth have nothing to gain from transition besides living as their authentic selves. Despite everything TERFs will tell you, access to women's bathrooms is really not worth the trauma. But if you're transitioning the other way, this scenario is at least theoretically reversed.
You can say whatever you want, but I have literally lived my life presenting in society as a woman and a man. I can tell you tangible evidence of male privilege that is unarguable.
Okay,
I'm not here
what?
to talk about statistics. I don't get spoken over as much anymore. I don't get interrupted as much. I'm really funny now. Like, people laugh at my jokes so much more than before. They're the same jokes. I get rewarded for being a feminist. People are, like, blown away by the fact that I care about women. Whereas when I was a woman, it was, you know, I was called bossy, I was called emotional, I was told that I was on my period if I was saying anything passionate and heartfelt. People would constantly only ever ask the boys to lift things even though I was strong. And now I am weak because I don't exercise anymore. And then people always assume that I can open the jars because I'm a dude.
To be clear, I am not saying trans men universally have it better than cis women or vice versa, because I think that's bollocks. The intersections of marginalised identities are complex, nuanced and varied. Blanket statements about privilege usually don't do them justice. What I am saying is that when society unambiguously hurts a group of people for who they are, is it surprising that some of them try to become someone else? The root of this issue is sometimes touched on by people concerned about detransition. They walk right up to a real problem and then U-turn away from it to point fingers at trans trenders and easy access to hormones. But if that was the problem, we should see the same narrative playing out across the board, not just in AFAB people. The question they should be asking isn't, why is transition so accessible? Because it's not. It's what makes being a woman suck so much that women try to escape it. It isn't trans people driving erroneous transition, it's the fucking patriarchy. Now you might be thinking, hold the phone, like, sure, being a woman sucks, but most women don't deal with that by growing a beard, there must be more to it. And yes, you're right. That's why detransition percentages are so low. Most people do, in fact, know what gender they are. But if you don't have strong feelings about your gender, if you're gender non-conforming, a tomboy, or even non-binary, then it can be easy to think, society tells me I am unfeminine and I dislike being a woman, so I therefore must be a man. And that's exactly what happened to me. Part 2. Binarism. Even after deciding not to transition, I still thought of myself as a man because I knew I wasn't a woman and that was the only other option I had. But I didn't express that because deep down I knew that wasn't really right either. I didn't talk to anyone about it because I didn't have a framework to express what I was feeling. So I just stayed in the closet and was very unhappy. After leaving home, though, I met trans people who accepted people who didn't identify as male or female. They quickly understood what I was getting at and started to refer to me by they pronouns, and then everything clicked into place. Not everyone who regrets aspects of their transition or chooses not to transition at all isn't trans. And frequently they're non-binary. One of the biggest factors leading to wrong decisions being made when it comes to transition is non-binary not being presented as an option. Granted, understanding of non-binary genders has come a long way since I was a teenager, but it's still way on the back end of people's general understanding of trans issues. And this is because it challenges the notion of binary gender in a way that can't be brushed under the carpet. Binary trans fits more neatly within pre-existing gender narratives, and as such, that is the prevailing one. In order to get on the waiting list for the GIC, my doctor, who was amazing, just flat out lied on my form and said that I was binary trans in order to get me through the door. But the problem isn't just in healthcare. There are huge pressures within the trans community to be just one gender or another, and on top of that to do a convincing job of it. And in the wider world, non-binary identities are rarely legally recognised. If this is all you're exposed to, and you realise that you're not the gender you were assigned at birth, then what choice do you have except to assume you're the other one, even if that's not quite right either? An essential part of reducing transition regret is to present non-binary as an option. But more than that, We need to break our binary way of thinking. For example, even when non-binary is allowed, there can still be a pressure to prove it. This definitely happened to me at one of my GIC appointments. After deeming my presentation sufficiently gender neutral, the doctor asked me questions like, I don't know if he was a doctor, whatever he was. The guy asked me questions like, why haven't you changed your name? And why haven't you come out to your boss? And I found myself justifying those things with things like, well, Shanalika isn't a very common name, so I don't feel like it's implicitly gendered. And as for my boss, so long as I get the work done, he really doesn't care if I'm a sea slug. When in reality, all of this is irrelevant. I could have rocked up in a pink miniskirt and it wouldn't have made me any less non-binary. Superficially, it might seem logical that if you're not male or female, you must be some kind of neutral androgynous alien. Which some people are, and that's great. But by defining ourselves in that way, we can end up conforming to yet another predetermined narrative that doesn't give us the space to be who we really are. The binary remains the essential construct around which our identities are based. Presenting stereotypically androgynous for the sake of presenting androgynous, rather than because that happens to be how you want to present, might not solve your problems, and it could create new ones. And the pressure to do so is part of the final contributor to transition regret that I want to discuss in this video. Part 3. Transmedicalism. Transmedicalism is the belief that A, you must have dysphoria to be trans, and B, that dysphoria must be treated by medical transition. This is harmful because it approaches dysphoria purely as a personal problem rather than one created or worsened by society. It's not possible to fully separate personal and social dysphoria because they don't exist in a vacuum and one informs the other. However, drawing a degree of distinction can help identify the causes of dysphoria, therefore informing more accurately as to what should be done about it. Let's take top surgery as an example. You might want to get rid of your boobs because it feels inherently disgusting and gross, which for many people, it does. But let's just say that it doesn't. Your freedom is still restricted. People with female-presenting nipples are expected to cover them up. Then on top of that, more skin must be covered up to reduce sexualization and harassment. Physical and social discomfort are constantly pitted against one another in a never-ending tightrope walk to strike the least uncomfortable balance between both. Seeing men happily running around topless in summer is a galling reminder of this disparity in freedom, one that is barely acknowledged or challenged on this most basic level. Although we're very good at noticing virtually identical double standards in other cultures, but again, that's a whole different topic. Inequality inflicted onto certain types of bodies can cause their owners to start viewing them with anger and resentment. The social dysphoria feeds the physical. And this applies to all sorts of people. Brown people, fat people, people who don't meet conventional standards of beauty, disabled people, and people with female bodies. Again, gender crits come so close to understanding this, but you turn away from the solution. The onus always goes back onto the individual rather than the system. You should just be a gender, even if you don't like it. You should love your body, even if the world degrades you for having it. You shouldn't change parts of yourself that other people punish you for having. We need to change society, but we don't do that by asking individuals to just stand by and take the trauma. The vast majority of people do not regret their transition. But when they do, the tragedy isn't that those changes were available to them. It's that society didn't let them live freely as they were. Transitioning primarily due to social dysphoria is totally fine and valid. The important thing is being aware of it. It's important to acknowledge the complexity of the situation if you might not want certain changes if only the world was less shit. You can't just pick a gender box and follow the instructions. You need to consider every item in it and why it will benefit you specifically, especially if you have a more non-binary experience. If you're agender like me, it might be less a case of picking what you want and more a case of picking what you don't want least. If you're gender fluid, it might be difficult to choose. Sometimes you have to make peace with having made the best decisions that you could under the circumstances. The desire for perfection in society affects trans people too. Transition isn't a perfect cure-all, and it's unrealistic to expect it to be. Still, it's clear that our rigidly gendered society does push some people into changes that are very much less than ideal for them, in some cases leading to detransition. So what's the solution? Well, obviously change society, but what can we do as individuals? Well, we can accept people as they are. This doesn't mean expecting your gender non-conforming kid to be cis or assuming that they're trans. It means letting them lead the way, whether that's with regards to what toys they play with as a child or legally changing their name as an adult. Your job isn't to guide, but to follow. And if you've really taken the time to understand what transness and, for that matter, gender itself is, this shouldn't be too difficult, because none of that stuff equals gender. Not even hormones and surgery equal gender. You can be a trans man and go on T, you can be non-binary and go on T, and while it might be controversial to say it, I see no reason why you can't be a cis woman and go on T if you have assessed that those changes would be better for you. I bring this hypothetical up because we need to move away from assessing whether or not someone is really the gender they say they are and giving them the full set of gender TM as a reward for performing that gender perfectly. Instead, treatment should be made on the basis of what will make that person most comfortable and happy in their body. That means accepting that women can be autistic and men can wear skirts, cis and trans. It means understanding that short dyed hair and baggy clothes don't equal non-binary. It means allowing people to microdose, to start and stop hormones, to get surgery without hormones. It means not freaking out if your kid wants to be called twig and use they pronouns. When I was in school, everyone was bisexual for a bit, now everyone's trans for a bit, they're experimenting with their identity, it's normal, who gives a shit if most of them don't transition? Calling your kid a name and pronouns they might not stick with won't harm them. If anything, it will show them that their identity is respected without their having to jump through any hoops. We need to treat people, not as genders. No judgment, no you aren't really this unless you do that, no shame for exploring something that doesn't work out. Again, if getting the works is right for you, great, it is for a lot of people. But we need to create a world where people are also free to be Blair White's worst nightmare and proud of it. Contrary to everything transmedicalists will tell you, I became more accepting of my body after people accepted me as trans without proof. Affirmation of my gender didn't give me dysphoria, it helped to heal it. No matter how informed patients are or how good the standard of medical care is, individuals will mess up. That's just part of the nature of any medical procedure. What's unique to transition is the intensity of gender-related pressures surrounding it, the degree to which it fucks with what is expected, and the ensuing moral panic. You don't see this level of concern surrounding tattoos or nose jobs.
Because this whole idea of kids transitioning is predicated upon the belief that you always know, right?
Yeah.
It's on the basis that when you know, you know. When you say it, it means it's 100% true. It's not the case. I'm sure you'd agree.
I think one person who comes out and says, like, I transitioned as a child and now I regret it, I think that's enough to say that no one should be able to.
What people don't seem to understand is that you have to choose one set of hormones or another. So there's a risk that you'll get it wrong whether you transition or not. At the end of the day, you're more likely to know what you want now than the doctor did when you were a baby. And if something does go wrong, well, if detransitioners prove anything, it's that you can continue to transition into who you are even if your body has changed in a way you didn't want. Trans people prove that every day, which really highlights the double standard that transphobes can hold in sympathizing with those trying to reverse changes they chose, while demonizing those of us trying to reverse changes forced upon us against our will. Almost as if it's not really about detransitioners and their suffering, but a hegemonic narrative that suppresses all deviance. When Buck Angel laments people taking hormones when they aren't really trans, but gatekeeps what being trans is, he pressures people into making mistakes. It is a contradiction when J.K. Rowling says, just be a deviant woman, while policing what is and isn't feminine. These are the contributors to detransition that we need to be fighting. Misogyny, binarism, and transmedicalism. Attempts to restrict deviance, bigotry masquerading as concern. Because the reality is that the people most concerned about detransition are creating the conditions that cause it. Special thanks to my monthly coffee supporters, Alf Joffer, Comrade Jean-Michel, Danicron, Deletor, Isaac DF, Evalshin, Jake, Gel1234, Jeffayette, Kaylee, Lars, Meru Azur, Mirsal, Nerdy, Phil Nadeau, Rebecca Solar Willpower, Rowan Thomas, Sansath, Tayan, TX Watson, Void Drone, Yasarian on a Tree, Zoe Phoenix, Zotozan, and Zivin. Making this video was a hell of a process, so if you found it useful, I could really use your support. Become a monthly supporter over on my Ko-fi, or if you don't want to do that, liking my video, sharing it, and commenting is also really helpful. If you want to give me some suggestions on less difficult videos to do in the future, please follow me on social media. Oh! Fuck my feet! Oh my god, I've got really bad pins and needles.